I call to order this special meeting of the Governing Board for the Scottsdale Unified School District. It is Monday, November 23rd, 2020, and the time is 5:03 p.m. We will be wearing our masks at all times during the meeting tonight so that there isn't any confusion regarding mask safety protocol. Fellow board members, please speak as clearly and into your mic as you can. Thank you very much. All rise, and Vice President Beckman, will you please lead us in the pledge?
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. I will have a roll call starting on my right.
Jan Michael Greenberg.
Sandy Kravitz.
Barbara Perleberg. Patty Beckman.
And Allison Beckham. All 5 governing board members present, and we have a quorum. We are having this special meeting to provide an opportunity for our community, district staff, as well as the governing board to understand the current COVID statistics, school metrics, state metrics, and discuss the rationale for decisions that have been made and will be made during this very difficult time of the pandemic. Do I have any, as we approve the agenda, do we have any changes to the agenda? All right. I move to approve the agenda as presented. Do I have a second?
Second.
Board Member Greenberg seconds. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. All opposed? Motion carries 5-0. We'll move on to information and discussion items. Discussion item A, review of metrics for in-person, virtual, and hybrid teaching and learning models, including our past board approvals. Dr. Menzel, do you have any comments, and would you like to begin the presentation?
President Beckham, Vice President Beckman, and members of the governing board, thank you. I would like to suggest that I have a PowerPoint presentation that incorporates all 3, A, B, and C. And with your permission, I would just like to go through that to cover each one of those information and discussion items.
That is fine.
I'd like to ask the tech team if we can start the PowerPoint presentation. Okay, so I would like to begin this evening by acknowledging the uniqueness of the challenges we are facing and the current context of increasing COVID cases in our community. I want to thank our teachers, support staff, and administrators for all the work they are doing to meet the needs of our Scottsdale students during these challenging times. Tonight I want to spend a little bit of time reviewing where we've been, talking about the benchmark metrics that were adopted, reviewing our own statistics, and talking about the present moment and where we go from here. So as you recall, on July 9th, which was really less than 5 months ago, but seems like a lot longer than that, the governing board adopted a return to learn plan. On July 23rd, Governor Ducey issued Executive Order 2020-51. The reason why that one's important is it has a lot of requirements for school districts with respect to implementing an educational program for this current year. One of those that's really important for our conversation this evening is the requirement to provide on-site learning support when a district is either providing virtual learning or in a hybrid model. And I just want to make sure that we've flagged that because that came subsequent to the time that we adopted our initial return to learn plan. On August 10th, our schools started as originally scheduled. All of our students were online in enhanced distance learning at that time. On August 6th, which is not shown on this timeline, the Arizona Department of Health Services put forward their recommended benchmarks, and we'll talk about those a little bit later. And on August 18th, we convened a meeting, discussed and reviewed those Arizona Department of Health Services benchmarks, and adopted those metrics for reopening schools. On September 14th, we began our phased-in return to in-person learning. As you recall, that week we started with our special education students. We had an initial orientation or welcome for kindergarten students. And then the following week, we added K2. The week after that, grades 3 through 5. And October 12th, all of our students that chose to return to learn in person were back in school with us. So the benchmark metrics that were approved by the Arizona Department of Health Services provided criteria for returning to in-person instruction either in a hybrid format defined by the Arizona Department of Health Services as some students being online and some in person. There was never any specificity with respect to a particular percent or structure, and in fact, the language in the Arizona Department of Health Services Return to Learn guidance document indicates that that's up to individual districts to determine how that would be structured. It also included recommendations for when to return to all virtual education with on-site support. You may recall at that time it indicated that if one or more of the benchmark metrics returned to red, that's when, for 2 consecutive weeks, that's when schools should return to virtual education with on-site support. But then on October 20th, those guidelines were changed, and instead of being 1 benchmark metric returning to red, they modified that to 3. I'm not sure that I've seen a lot of discussion about the rationale. I know a lot of people have asked questions, but those changes were made and were adopted and embraced by the Maricopa County Department of Public Health. So that when you look at what the state has provided and what the county has provided with respect to those benchmark metrics, the tipping point for a recommendation to return to all virtual education with on-site support is all 3 benchmark indicators being read for 2 consecutive weeks. However, in all of the documents, they also note that it is the recommendation for each governing board and school district to consult with county public health officials and leave the final decision in the hands of our local governing boards. I just wanted to note as well, our discussion on August 18th really centered around the reopening metrics. We didn't spend as much time on what it would take to go back to all virtual education. We did spend some time discussing that. And at that meeting, we did reference the use of our 15 zip codes as framing for having those conversations. So just as a reminder for people who may be watching and for governing board members, there are 3 levels of community spread that the benchmarks address. The first are the number of cases per 100,000. So when you're over 100 per 100,000, that's indicative of substantial community spread. If you're between 10 and 100 cases, that's moderate spread, and then less than 10 cases per 100,000 would be minimal. Percent positivity is another benchmark indicator. If it's greater than 10%, that's again evidence of substantial community spread. Between 5 and 10% moderate, less than 5% minimal. And then COVID-like illnesses, which is the most difficult metric to kind of figure out what does it really mean. Over 10% would be substantial, 5 to 10% moderate, and 5% would be minimal. So in these environments, if you were all 3 in the red at substantial community spread, the recommendation of the Arizona Department of Health Services and Maricopa County Department of Public Health says school districts return to virtual with on-site support. If it's less than that, so you could have 1 or 2 in substantial, but not all 3, then their recommendation is hybrid with discussions about making plans for, preparing for the potential return to virtual or on virtual learning with on-site support. So as you know, we've been tracking our 15 zip codes in Scottsdale Unified School District since that time. This chart by now should be very familiar because we update it every week. We get the department information that's provided on Thursday mornings, and then Dr. Bachna and her team puts this together so we can kind of gauge where our 15 zip codes are. And as you can see, with respect to case counts, 3 weeks ago, we had a handful that were in the red. And each week, that number has grown pretty significantly. And for the first time this past reporting period, every zip code had exceeded the 100 per 100,000 number of cases. And as a district, we've been now in the red on that metric on the weighted average for 3 weeks. Our percent positivity has been yellow for some period of time, but the number is going up incrementally. It's my expectation, given the data that we've seen, that our percent positivity is likely to be at or around 10% with this upcoming reporting period. I'm expecting that we'll see those on Wednesday instead of Thursday, since Thursday is Thanksgiving. And I would anticipate, unless there's some dramatic change in the data or surprise, that on December 4th we will have been red for 2 consecutive weeks in the percent positivity as well. And I think it's important just to acknowledge that as a district, our overall community context reflects a growing number of COVID cases in the Scottsdale Unified School District area. I also would say that it's important to then drill down and say what's happening in our schools. We talked about looking at what are the community indicators. We also need to understand what's happening in our schools. This report we have also been providing on a regular basis to our community. It identifies the total number of students and staff that are located in each one of our sites in person. That is the baseline for which then we do the rest of the calculation. The second column, after you've identified the schools, identifies the total confirmed active cases, students and staff, for the week on this particular site. And the data is collected Friday through Thursday. So Thursday at 5 is the cutoff, and then Friday mornings we review the data to make sure that we've populated it accurately. Some people have asked why we don't separate staff and students, but if you only had one staff member at one site and that person was out, you might be able to identify the individual. So our goal is to protect the privacy of individuals. And so while we have that data, what's reported publicly to protect the privacy rights of individuals is aggregate numbers here. When you look at the percent of confirmed active cases on in any building, you can see that they range from 0% to a high of 1.07% at Redfield. Those numbers vary from week to week. The last 2 weeks, we've had a total of 39 active cases. The week prior, there were more staff that had positive tests than this past week. And then the buildings that have experienced additional cases change from time to time as well. The final column identifies the total number of active cases that have been on campus. These numbers do not include any of our EDL or Scottsdale Online students that may have positive COVID tests because they would not have been on campus, with the exception of any student who may have been participating in athletics, in which case we would report those. Another number that I think is important for our conversation this evening are the quarantine numbers. So as you know, when a positive, at least I believe you all know, a positive case is identified either through a report from a parent to a school nurse who then asks for the documentation, we send that to Maricopa County Department of Public Health. We do not have to wait for them to confirm the case, provided our nurse has in hand a copy of either a positive PCR test or an antigen test. At that point in time, our staff at the building level identify close contacts, which is why our seating charts are so important, so that we can identify who would have been a close contact as defined by Maricopa County Department of Public Health and the CDC, which is within 6 feet or less for 15 minutes or more within a 24-hour period of time. We've quarantined 1,517 individuals as of November 19th as a result of close contact in school with a lab-confirmed positive case. There are another 315 students who we know were quarantined as a result of exposure outside of school. So it wasn't something that we did, but because they had exposure outside, they were on quarantine and let us know. So a total of 1,832 students have been quarantined since we've been back in person. This is one of those challenges where it's disruptive to the learning environment when students are in and out, but at the same time, it's absolutely essential if we're going to be able to have any hope of continuing to provide in-person learning during a pandemic. The other important factor at the present time is, in talking with our nurses, we have no known positive cases from students who were quarantined as a result of being a close contact in school. So people ask, how do you know that there's no evidence of spread? One indicator is that we don't have, at least at this point, any reports of people who were quarantined that tested positive after that quarantine period of being a close contact. That doesn't mean that they don't exist, because in some cases, somebody might not have been tested and didn't come back until after a 14-day period of time. There could be some other explanatory variables, but we don't have any evidence of that at the present time. So in making a determination on when to close, close is the wrong word, when to return to online learning with on-site support, Maricopa County has published the following categories. The first is the level of community transmission, which we just reviewed. Whether cases have been identified among students and staff, and you know that we track that weekly, but we're actually looking at the data on a daily basis. If cases are identified, how many classrooms are affected, percent absenteeism in the school, student population being affected, so the age of the students, classrooms affected, etc., the model of instruction delivery and mitigation plans in place, and finally, the importance of in-person education to the social, emotional, and academic growth and well-being of the student population. So we've reviewed a number of these. The percent absenteeism in the school is not really an issue. So for the health department, that's got to be about 50% before they start thinking you should shut down. And we're and haven't been at 50% absenteeism of our student population at all. So that really doesn't become anything that's surfaced as part of the consideration. But what has, and what we'll review in just a minute, is the question about availability of staff. So shorthand version, when we're meeting with Maricopa County Department of Public Health, they want to know number of cases in a building, evidence of spread, worrisome spread within a building, and then whether or not we've got sufficient staff in order to be able to safely provide in-person education. So those are really the three core indicators. This is the full list, but we're always looking at those. So when you think about mitigation strategies, because those are one of the areas that they're focusing on, you know that pursuant to Executive Order 2020-51, each board was required to have a mask-wearing policy. More recently, ADHS put out a directive that actually upped the ante and made it an absolute requirement for masks to be worn in school, on school buses, at school events, because they recognize the importance of universal mask wearing as a mitigation strategy for the spread of COVID. Physical distancing, during this first semester, we've had a minimum of 3 feet of separation between students in the classrooms as our commitment. Increased hand washing stations. There are 36 new stations at elementary and K buildings, and then we put hand sanitization stations in the high schools and the middle schools to address those concerns. We implemented enhanced cleaning protocols. We have a requirement for our students and our staff to stay home when sick. I wish that I could report that everyone follows that. Sometimes they don't, but when they don't, there's students in particular are sent to the nurse and then sent home. We really need our community to continue to follow this directive, and we also need our staff to. It's one of those things in our culture where people, are committed to their work. They want to come to work. They're not maybe feeling the greatest, but, they're committed to doing their job. When in doubt, if you are not feeling well, we need people to stay home as a part of our mitigation strategy. Then what's really critical here is to identify positive cases, to isolate those, quarantine close contacts as quickly as possible. And this becomes a critical element of our mitigation strategy. We are grateful for the parents who have identified positive cases and shared that with us quickly. There's only one case to my knowledge where we found out first from the Maricopa Department of Public Health and not from the student or family. But I did confirm with the health department that they will, if in reviewing their case record of known positives, if we haven't submitted a school-age student to them and they find out about it, they will let us know as well, so that we can cross-reference the students who have had positive COVID tests and then take appropriate action. And finally, we are operating in a hybrid model. It didn't pan out exactly how we had talked about in terms of we surveyed our community. It looked like 50% wanted to stay online until the metrics were green or we had a vaccine. 50% wanted to return in person. What that ended up really being is 70% returned in person, 30% stayed either in Scottsdale Online or EDL. But it still meets the definition of hybrid according to the Arizona Department of Health Services. So that takes us to the sub-fill rate, and I did not intentionally make the slide presentation so small that you can't read it, but I want to tell you what's here, And then when we get to the Q&A portion of this discussion, we do have Dr. Bowman and others from Human Resources to help explain in more detail what's here. But first, I'll say that this chart represents the cumulative number of subs requested versus those that were filled. And the chart from left to right, you have our schools, then each day, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. So you can see the number of subs needed on Mondays at Anasazi from October 12th to November 20th were 3. The number that were filled were 3. So 100% of the sub requests at Anasazi for the time we've been back in person, they had it completely filled. In fact, they've been filled every day for the entire time, and they've only needed 12 subs. Not every building has that same story to share, and so as you look on the far right-hand side of the column, that total is really where we can spend a little bit more time. And if you go to the bottom, you'll see that we're at just about 71% of our sub-requests are filled on every day. Last year, that percent was closer to 90. And so what we're seeing is that we do have a gap between the number of subs that are requested and the number that we're able to fill on any given day. Additionally, it's important to know that our sub-requests are down by about a third from a year ago. That's really probably not surprising in the sense that we got 30% of our kids that are in an online environment, so perhaps less of a need for subs at that particular time. The other thing in this chart, it doesn't only represent teacher absences, but it includes parapros in the classroom and counselors. So you have more than just teachers represented in this sub list. There are also a couple of cases where we have sub requests for Azella testing. So a classroom is not vacant, but we put in a sub request for that building where the testing's being done, and so you would see that as part of the N, even if it wasn't filled. So then we look at some of the specific data and talk to the principals to find out, how do they fill those unfilled positions? How do they ensure that there's coverage in the classroom? And depending on the building, that varies. And so our biggest challenge so far this year has been chaparral, where we've had counselors, social workers, assistant principals, even the principal filling in classrooms to cover. And you can see their overall fill rate is at 55.2%. So they've been cobbling together solutions in order to be able to cover. I don't know, Dr. Sakos, whether or not any teachers have been asked to cover during their prep period at Chaparral, but they have. So it's been all hands on deck in order to be able to provide that coverage. So one of the things that we've been looking at is where's the tipping point? And you might be able to, on an occasion, have a teacher cover during a prep period. But if you have to do that every day for weeks on end, that's not a sustainable strategy. So we think that this is an important data set to continue tracking. It's consistent with what the health department has said in terms of availability of staff to ensure safe in-person learning. Some of the numbers here might look troublesome, like the Ingleside numbers, but when we drill down into those numbers, if you were to look at 3 of 12 on that period of time, you're looking over a 6-week period. So then you say maybe that's an average of 2 every Monday for that period of time. There's likely staff within the building, whether it's a counselor, a social worker, someone who's not teaching, that covers that classroom if we haven't been able to fill it with a sub. So those are the kinds of things that we're drilling into to understand where the tipping points are and which are the buildings that are in jeopardy of not being able to continue providing in-person education safely given the staff absences. So as we're getting close to the conclusion of the presentation and time for discussion, I wanted to include just a few articles about the research on the impact of in-person learning and school closures. As a public education institution, our purpose is to educate students, and we're deeply committed to that purpose. And it's important to understand the impact of in-person teaching versus online, and there are a lot of other factors, and so I don't want this slide to be interpreted as dismissive of any of the concerns, anxiety, fears that our staff may have about what's happening in our larger community, because it's not intended to do that. But at the end of the day, I want to be sure that we're focusing on what the needs of our students are. And so the study in JAMA with respect to education of U.S. children's educational attainment and years of life lost is particularly chilling. Dr. Sonnenschein shared this research with me and has referenced it as a reason for why the health department at the present time doesn't recommend closing elementary schools. And in fact, they believe that the benefits outweigh the risk associated with it. And this research is a part of that recommendation. When we look at a couple of the articles in the Washington Post and the Atlantic and New York Times, they reference other studies and information that's been provided that help identify what the impact is of in-person versus remote learning. And there are a number of people, including the CDC, which came out. Dr. Redfield said recently they're not recommending that schools close at the present time. And Dr. Fauci, the nation's top infectious disease expert, said on November 19th, one of the things we need to do is try to keep the kids in school. His feeling is that default condition is to keep the schools open if you possibly can. Doesn't mean that there aren't times when schools should close, and in fact, there are times when schools should close. The question is being more surgical in our approach to ensure that we're taking into account all of the variables so that we don't create undue hardship for our students, but that we also ensure the safety, health, and well-being of all of the individuals that are in our school buildings. So with that, I would open it up to questions from the governing board and discussion.
All right. Governing board members, do you have any comments? Vice President Beckman.
I just have a question quickly on the sub-rate, fill rate. First of all, I know that I looked at Chaparral, and obviously that is difficult. But when I look at the entire Coronado complex, I see that overall, that complex right now is having, that learning community is having a difficult time. Can you go back to the sub-fill rates?
Yeah, we can.
When you look at Coronado High School, 66%. You look at Tonalea, 41%. You look at Hohokam Yavapai, 52%. So the entire learning community has a fairly low sub-rate. So I'm curious if that's been noted, and do we have any strategies to try and help out here?
So I'm going to actually see if Dr. Bowman's online. I know that he has collected information from the various principals to determine whether or not they're at a tipping point. And this is one of those areas where the percent fill rate may not be indicative of the actual ability to fill those classrooms based on other staff that are in the building. So I'm going to ask Dr. Bowman if he can speak to the Coronado complex.
Good evening. I count a little bit. Candidly, the closest look we've had at this data was for this meeting tonight. So it's pretty fresh. We don't look at it daily like that, but it's illuminated that we need to. And what I can, oh boy, that's rough. What I can say is that in that learning community, we asked the principals what their tipping point was based on unfilled absences and percent, maybe a percent of fill rate. And we didn't get back from that learning community specifically that they were at that tipping point, that it was at this point in time manageable. But I would say that district-wide, and bringing it back to this community too, but any unfilled absences is really stressful and hard on the schools, because what they have to do then is if it's unfilled, they have to meet those needs internally. And so the data set you're looking at is, we were asked to look at it by day of the week, in addition to in total. So that was the reason for that, is to see if Mondays and Fridays were more voluminous than Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursdays. So that's primarily what that data set is. And it does show that there's a higher absentee rate in that learning community. And I can't say today that we have specific strategies, but it certainly has been illuminated, and we will work collaboratively together with that learning community to see what else we can do.
Okay, kind of a follow-up question. When you say they look to fill that absence internally, what is that? Describe that right now for our parents and whatnot. I know our teachers are going above and beyond, working right now. So how do we provide for an education for those classes in this type of environment if someone doesn't, if they can't fill that position that day. I think we even have principals teaching in the classroom right now, correct?
Dr. Sakos and Dr. Hagigat, if you can speak to the question both universally and specifically with respect to the Coronado complex, if you have information from the principals.
Testing. Well, first and foremost, I want you to know that I received a text from Amy Palatucci that they've been able to cover their classes. So, and she's a big proponent for, as many of our principals are, for keeping the campuses open. The remaining of the schools within the Coronado learning community are under the direct supervision of Dr. Hagigat. So I'll let her speak to those. But in terms of Coronado, they've been able to make it manageable with utilizing the staff on campus to cover, with the counselors, the social workers, administration.
Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Sakos. And it's a very similar experience at the elementary level where Hohokam and Yavapai, Pima, they have been able also Tonalea to cover from within, but it's getting really tricky as the absenteeism goes up higher. And so what we're doing is looking at what do the principals think could be that tipping point. And part of our challenge is that in the past, maybe we were able to split classes, but right now we need to keep kids cohorted so that we increase that safety for them. And so they're not able to do that. So if they even have two absent at the same time and there are other things going on, that could take us to that tipping point. But it truly is site by site. But right now, I don't have any information that shares with me that we have not been able to cover. So we've been able to do that, but again, we haven't had that huge level of people that have been absent.
Okay.
Do you have a follow-up? Because I have a follow-up question.
Yeah, just one quick follow-up, and then I'll get off of this. But I think it's important to understand, we keep talking about that tipping point. So I would like that defined a little bit. What is the tipping point? What would we say this is too much? I know that when our teachers in a non-COVID environment, when they would internally cover, you would have a principal sometimes that would go around and find a teacher maybe that had their prep during that time and would ask them to come over and step in. And we don't really have that now because our teachers don't have a prep. So I'm just curious what the tipping point is, just so we can kind of look to this and not be caught off guard.
It's truly depending on the site. For example, I'll use Anasazi as a place to start. They are a much smaller school, so they don't have a lot of those specialists that often come in for interventions. So for them, a tipping point could be an absenteeism of 2 or 3 staff members that they're not able to cover because they only have 2 administrators. And if the administrators are doing their responsibilities and tending to an urgent matter, then at that point, we know that we've stretched ourselves more than we can handle at that particular school. Now I'll turn over to Yavapai and Hohokam. They have more specialists just as part of their Title I and other ways of being able to bring in adults. And so they wouldn't have the same circumstance of the 2 teachers, but in their case, it could extend to more of that 5 or 6 teachers, even though, although they're K-8, it could be that way. So it truly, we're looking at it site by site because circumstances are just very different. So we really can't say at 25% or 75% or 50% because that'll just completely not cover everything that we have according to the circumstances for each place.
And we did ask the principals, so in looking at that information, I'd hoped we could just get a percentage. That would make it easy. If it's below 65%, that's the number. What we're getting is it depends, right? So in some cases, it's difficulty covering a particular area, so special education might be the challenge. So it doesn't impact the whole building, but you've got a challenge with that one particular subset. In some others, it's when teachers are asked to cover. So if you can cover with other non-instructional staff, then even though you've had to pull people from their assignment in the building, the tipping point is perceived when you're actually taking a prep period away from a teacher. And the truth is, even though we increase the amount of pay for that, teachers need their prep time. Mm-hmm. And so that is, to me, a logical tipping point if you have that on a sustained basis. It's understandable if it's once in a while just because that happens, but if it's every day, every week for a period of time, that's a different concern. When you have all of your administrators spending time in the classroom and they're not able to do the other things in supporting the operation of the school, that would be a potential tipping point. So as we're looking at the data, and as Dr. Bowman mentioned, this is our first time to really put it in this format, but we think it's really important because that is one of the criteria that the health department looks at. Dr. Sonnenschein also said in this environment, if you ended up at a place where you needed to close a school because of this, you would do that for 2 weeks and then bring them back. So it's really about buying that window of time so that you can get your attendance back to a point where you don't need as many people to cover.
Thank you.
So I'd like to follow up with that line of the comments and then the answers. So I just want to make sure. So let's just take Coronado, and it shows that is it 66.7? Is that what that says? I don't have my-
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So that doesn't mean that 34% weren't covered. It just means that 34% weren't filled by, if you will, the professional substitute.
Correct.
So 25 classes didn't go without a teacher or an instructor. They were filled internally.
Correct.
Okay, I just want to make sure for the public who's looking.
Yeah, we didn't,
understand.
it's not that we had buildings that were on, or rooms that were uncovered, but I have heard stories where teachers might be in adjoining rooms and they're covering 2 classrooms. That becomes worrisome for me because we need to have a sub in each classroom. So that's yet another, when you have stories like that, that becomes an indicator that we're stretched beyond capacity to fill in those situations.
Okay. And it also sounds like from the answer, and I want to make sure I'm clear here, because you had mentioned a teacher might take just their prep time and then go into that classroom. So this is not just for an educator calling in and saying, I'm going to be sick the whole day. They could be sick half of the day and asking for a sub or a period in a sub. Is that what's in here too? Or was that just me reading too much literally into what you just said?
Dr. Bowman, can you answer that question? Are these reflective of full-day subs or it's could also be partial day?
I have to defer that one to Carly. Carly, can you answer that one, please?
It could include half-day subs
Okay,
as well as full-day.
okay. All right, thank you very much.
I just want to add one thing if I can. It's important to remember that we do have permanent subs on each of our campuses, so that has really provided a lot of relief this year. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention how our teachers and all of our campuses have really stepped up to help. And specific on the at the secondary level, when they only get their prep every other day. And so when they're asked to cover for that 73 minutes in one or more classes, depending on their prep, then it becomes very taxing on them. So I want to reiterate that they have really stepped up to help. They've been team players. But to Vice President's comment, I do too worry about what is that breaking point.
And to you had asked about, I am wondering the why. Why is our rate, it's not just the rate that's the 90% down. No, actually, the request for substitutes is down.
Down, yes.
Right? And from what I understand, we don't have the data broken down for the why they are absent, but we are going to be figuring that out.
Right, so our teachers have general leave. That can be used for sick, it can be used for any number of things, and so it's not specified that way. We do track teachers who are out with a COVID diagnosis or are quarantined, but it's not tracked in this data set, and so we have to pull that separate information separately.
Because I do think that would be helpful to know who is absent due to quarantine and who is absent due to actually COVID-like symptoms or
Right.
an illness itself. And maybe have that be a separate chart, because if all of a sudden we're seeing that creep up, that is going to be telling us
Right.
really the information that we really need to know.
The other piece of information that I didn't mention here that's important is we have 35 teachers that are teaching remotely. So they are not in the classroom. It's an accommodation that's been provided, and we have to have a sub in their classroom while they're teaching remotely. So that's 35 every day that's reflected in these numbers across our buildings as well.
And those are all filled with permanent subs at this point in time. Would that be a true statement, Dr. Bowman?
I don't know that all of those classrooms are filled with permanent subs. I think some may be. Dr. Bowman?
That's correct. They're not all filled with permanent subs. In some cases, the buildings themselves are covering them internally. And in a couple other cases, we have a long-term sub versus a permanent sub. And we're still actively pursuing hiring more people, as I think you've been aware of our campaign and strategies to increase our substitute pool. So we're continually working on that. And there are still one or two schools, I believe, that don't have a permanent sub today, in addition to those who are doing the EDL and the push-in remote teaching option.
All right, thank you. Board Member Greenberg.
New title, isn't that nice? So we don't know then, I appreciate that the total requests are down a third, but we don't know, because we don't have this data, I assume, from beforehand or from previous years, whether these numbers are lower, the same, or higher than the numbers for previous years. Like, we have no way of comparing whether we know the individuals are out with COVID or COVID-like illness or not. We have no way of saying, ooh, this year, the proportion or the proportion of needed classrooms is much higher than in previous years.
We can look at the daily request for subs from year to year. Looking at my chart. So for this past week of November 16th through 20th, a year ago we had 467 requests for subs. This year is 379. So we can compare, but it's not apples to apples, because we're, got 30% of our students in Scottsdale Line and EDL. If you look at some other weeks, our first week of opening, that same period of time, last year were 316 sub requests and 295 this year. That second week we were open, there were 495 requests the prior year to 345 this year. So the requests are definitely down this year, but it's just hard to be able to make an apples to apples comparison because of the number of students and staff who are actually on campus.
You said that and I appreciate that this is fresh data, you said that really in speaking to the principals so far, the main school where we're having concerns is Chaparral. Is that correct?
Chaparral is the top of the list. There are a couple of others that feel like they're very close. Mountainside Middle School is another one of those. Cocopah, Pueblo. So you get a few that are closer to that tipping point than others. And so that's what we're trying to get our arms around. But Chaparral has really been out in front. They've had the largest number of COVID positive cases. They've struggled with managing that. We've had subs that chose not to sub there because there was a lot of media coverage around Chaparral, so it made it even more difficult to fill the classrooms. So absolutely, they're the number one on the list.
So are the other high schools feeling that way, or is it really just Chaparral and then some of the middle schools and some of the potentially elementary schools?
So I can turn to Dr. Sackos. I've had some conversations, but I know she meets regularly with the high school principals to talk about that.
Absolutely. And before I forget about this, we also do have instructional coaches and some of our teachers on assignment providing coverage as well. So an all hands on deck approach is how we plan for when returning after fall break. So we do have some of our coaches. I know our fine arts coordinator is out. She teaches a class every single day. So we do have those as well. When we talk about are these, classes being uncovered, we find the bodies to do it. But again, it gets to the point of, taxing people with their regular duties. And going to the comment, Chaparral is certainly our most challenging campus. I don't think that the media has helped us much, because our subs will say they don't want to go to Chaparral because of the number of cases. So that certainly is a difficult school to cover. Desert Mountain High School is beginning to feel the pinch. The Coronado is actually doing pretty well. They've been able, they haven't had counselors or administration covering very frequently, so they're actually doing very well. Saguaro has done a nice job. They're not, there are times where, again, it's day by day in terms of filling it. Arcadia has been doing extremely well. They have the highest fill rate in coverage, and that's all 5 of the traditional high schools.
Thank you. So if I can pivot slightly on this, because we're looking at the numbers here, we're looking at the data, we're looking at what the county health department has told us. Looking a little forward to this Thanksgiving break and the next 2 weeks thereafter, are there concerns that the county has put forward about, maybe there should be at least a delay? I know that Great Hearts has implemented a 3-day delay, which my understanding is that isn't really a useful tool, that it has to be at least 7 days if they're going to do it that way. I know that Basis is closing for the 2 weeks and moving to virtual. Has there been any discussion about that and what the thoughts are around those issues?
I appreciate the question and have had some discussions with the counties. But while they're not recommending a return to virtual yet, they do have elevated concerns in terms of what's happening with the case rate in our community and the direction of positivity. They're more concerned at the high school level than at the elementary. As I mentioned previously, the benefit risk analysis leads them squarely in the side of our elementary should remain open. That's really important. And I ask about middle schools because they somehow straddle this fence and they would treat them more as elementaries than high schools. And I think there's legitimate reason to have some additional concern at the high school level. Even what we saw after fall break and the number of positive cases when people traveled, high schoolers, and I don't want to overgeneralize, but sometimes as they get together and do things, they're less risk averse and engage in some behavior outside of school that can be riskier. So that's why I think the county has elevated concerns, but they've been consistent in saying we're still going to look at the data in your buildings and use that as the guidepost for their recommendations. So at this juncture, even though there's an elevated sense of concern, there's not a recommendation to return to virtual, but it is something that's being monitored very closely. And so I would anticipate that that continues to be watched as we get new data sets, and there could be a change in that guidance at some point.
So if we have these, if we have a number of schools, and it sounds like a number of the schools that are maybe near this breaking point are middle schools. If a high school like Chaparral or the high schools generally were to move to virtual for the 2-week period between Thanksgiving and pretty much the end of this semester, are those subs that are generally able to be moved into the middle schools and deal with all these knock-on effects of, teachers not only having to teach their class and do the virtual class, but then also having to cover for other teachers who might be absent because they're ill or for whatever reason, or principals doing the same. Is that generally possible with these substitutes, or is it that they're really there for the high school students, or they're really there for the middle school students?
So while they would, any sub has a choice to accept or decline an opportunity to sub, it theoretically would free up a significant number of subs to be available to be repurposed in those other buildings to cover those sub needs. So if you return some of our schools to online with on-site support, you would theoretically still have an increased number of subs available to cover in the other buildings.
Okay, thank you. One other question. With the athletics situation, team sports is winding down, but that has been a major area of spread, and it is an area that the CDC notes youth sports in its school guidance. It does have a high risk, especially if you're interacting quite frequently with coaches and you are playing other teams often enough. Is there any discussion about stopping those sports? What is the position currently?
So this was a moving target. So a week ago, we had metrics from AIA that indicated if you were at certain thresholds, you weren't even allowed to practice for winter sports. And then on Thursday, they made a different decision. And so I think it's important for people to understand that change in the rationale for the change because it is important. First, I was not happy to hear the change because we're working really hard to ensure that we can keep schools open for in-person instruction. And there is some concern around athletics and the potential spread there. What AIA observed, and this is my understanding of it, so I hope to get it accurate, and eventually we can get additional information if something isn't quite accurate. But when we were on pause for winter sports, club sports were going full throttle. And club sports don't have the same level of risk mitigation strategies, protocols for screening for symptoms, requiring students to not participate if they're sick. And so AIA began to have the conversation, would our student athletes actually be safer if they're doing it in a regulated environment where we have screening protocols, where we check temperatures when they come to practice, where we have expectations for following those risk mitigation strategies as a condition of participating, and that was their determination, that it would be better. So in their rules, you can't participate in the club sport and compete in the winter sport. So it was designed to actually allow for some more control in implementing those risk mitigation strategies. That wasn't enough for us to feel comfortable, though. And so the other thing that we're proposing to implement as a part of a condition to participate in winter sports at Scottsdale Unified is that parents agree that their student athlete will be part of a COVID testing expectation as well. We're working with Embry Women's Health to be able to provide that testing for free. Dr. Sonnenschein recommends that we do that at least on a weekly basis, but some of those details need to be worked out. But we believe it's important to implement a testing protocol in addition to the other screening mechanisms if we're going to be able to move forward with those sports. And so that's kind of where we're at the present time.
How do the staff feel about Thanksgiving and working, these next 2 weeks from elementary up through high school? And the reason I ask is I've discussed with staff, and I've looked at, if we recall at the last meeting, the Scottsdale Education Association presented us a survey of teaching staff. And in kind of digging down a little bit, just scraping the surface of that detail, it seems like, yes, there are concerns. There's certainly staff that have concerns at the elementary level, but by and large, the elementary staff are comfortable with this because they feel that it's the best way of working with their students and that we don't really have too many cases. But as you move up the grade levels, the concern becomes, it seems, very strong, especially because these are individuals working in a closed space with their staff on a daily with their students on a daily basis. And this is Thanksgiving. It's very clear in our community that people will be traveling and moving around, and whether they voluntarily quarantine is unknown, and if they are, then they're in virtual for the remainder of the semester anyways. So what is the position right now? And I know we do have some staff members here. I don't know if they're here to speak or not, but what are we looking at here? What is their fear? What can we do to support them?
So like you, we've received a number of emails, Let's Talk dialogues, concerns from staff, and I've received emails that definitely are asking us to consider returning to online because of the predicted spike in COVID cases. But I've also had a number of teachers say that really, please don't do that. And by and large, those who are saying please don't do that are elementary, but not all. I've had a number of high school teachers indicate that they actually feel safer being in school than anywhere else because people are following the protocol. And so we do have a mixed bag, and there are a number of concerns, and while we can't mitigate all of those concerns or risk, I think we can do some things. We do have a supply of KN95 masks that we're going to be sending out to the buildings to provide that extra level of support. In talking with Dennis Rayler, if teachers would like to have plexiglass dividers at their desk, we now have the ability to procure that. You might remember in the summer we couldn't get it. Was one of the problems. Now we can. And so we're very interested in hearing what are the other mitigation strategies we can put in place to kind of alleviate that concern. I think there are two other parts of it. One, I think there was and has been a heightened sense of concern at the secondary level ever since we reviewed our plan for second semester. And the idea of coming back for full days of instruction, 6 period and lunch, has been really stressful. On December 1st, we're going to revise that Plan B recommendation for how we address that so that we can extend essentially what we're doing now with the 3 periods a day and dismissing before lunch, and we'll tighten up the learning in the afternoon, that asynchronous period of time, because the health department has said to us very clearly they're concerned about lunch at a secondary campus. Just the number of students who are on campus, and then you add those passing periods, it creates more potential risk for spread of COVID than you might like. And if you look at across our high schools, some have more capacity than others to take advantage of outdoor eating opportunities, for example. So we're going to revise that recommendation. That should help. So then the real question becomes, what's the risk in this 3-week period of time? So after Thanksgiving, you've got the high school level, 2 weeks of instruction. That final week is usually a review for the first 2 days, and the last 3 days are exams. At the middle school and elementary level, it's a little bit different, but you've got 3 weeks of instruction. One of my concerns, one of the things I think we should be thinking about is, based on all of the modeling that I've seen, I don't expect that when we get into January that we're going to see a dramatic decrease in the number of COVID cases because we have more holiday opportunities to get together. Thanksgiving is one of those where we're seeing a lot of people make a choice to go visit friends and family and take that risk, notwithstanding the advice of CDC and Dr. Fauci and anyone else that you hear in the public health world talking about, making some sacrifice now for the longer term good. When we get to the New Year holiday, I expect that there's going to be more potential spread of COVID. So our start of the second semester might look very similar to what our start in September looked like, where we're phasing in with elementary students, and it might be a couple of weeks before you bring your high school students back. So for me, when you think about potential lost instructional time or the impact of the number of students who don't do well in an enhanced distance learning environment and need in person, I think we need to take that into consideration because you're going to have 3 weeks from November 30th to the end of the semester. Then you've got the 2 weeks of the break, and then the potential that in-person might not resume right away for our secondary students, given what might be happening with COVID. I don't want to mislead the community to think that I'm looking in a crystal ball and believe that suddenly the data is going to look a lot better on January 4th. I would love it if it did, but we just don't know if that's going to be the case. And so I think we should be preparing realistically for what that might look like.
Okay, thank you. No further questions right now.
Okay, thanks.
Board Member Kravitz.
I think it's important that we look at the data that is specific to each school before we make any decisions on what our action is. I mean, because if you were to look at the SUSD COVID metrics, it would look like Navajo is pretty red, but then you look at their number of cases and they're at 0. So that may not match up. I'm also interested to know, Dr. Menzel, if you could tell us, explain the data collection from Maricopa County Department of Health. Is there a lag? There seems to be, I recall in our community, that there's a lag from Maricopa County Department of Health, so the data isn't accurate enough for some people. And you mentioned that the data is collected Friday to Thursday. Is it of that week, or we're getting data that's a week old? You've spoken with Dr. Sonnenschein several times, so if you could share with us what you know.
So the Maricopa County data, twofold. One, in looking at case data, there is some lag because they just have a volume of cases. I asked the question because we had heard a report that there were 3 times or 4 times more cases than were reported. So I followed up on that specifically, and they crosswalked the list that we had and the list that they had, and they said even any lag in reporting from our review would not account for that difference. So they couldn't identify where those numbers were coming from, and they had a question about how you could get to those numbers. So we're working very closely to make sure that we've accounted for all of the known positive cases. Remember, any lab-confirmed positive cases required to be reported to the health department. Now, there are some people who may access labs that don't report, but we've even reported the one that we've got concerns about to the Attorney General's office. I mean, there are concerns about potential bad actors, but we don't have direct knowledge about how many or what the scope of that would be. So we're going based on the actual data. What's reported in the Arizona Department of Health Services metrics are lab-confirmed positive cases. So then theoretically, you would be able to draw down to the individual level, and the health department is the one that verifies those cases, and if they don't see them on our list, then they'll let us know of those. So there shouldn't be a body of potential positive cases that are known to the health department but not known to us if they're in our schools.
Well, just follow up. Are most of the districts in our neighboring districts, have they adopted the guidelines of the Department of Health?
So it varies, so Paradise Valley developed their own.
Right, that one I was.
Right. Dysart uses the Maricopa County Department of Public Health Services questions that we have there, so I don't know if they're using the benchmark metrics per se, but they're using those questions and really focusing on, do we close a classroom, do we close a building? That's what they're looking at. Deer Valley is following that similar strategy. Cave Creek, Fountain Hills, following the same thing. Mesa, Chandler. In Chandler's case, they did decide to add something to their decision-making metrics. So if I remember this correctly, if an elementary building gets to 1%, they'll close for 2 weeks. If a middle school is at 1.5%, they'll close for 2 weeks. If a high school is at 2%. So they put in a threshold. If their number of active cases exceed that, then they'll move that building into virtual for 2 weeks to address the concern. And I think there may be other districts looking at something like that, but those would be in addition to using the benchmark metrics.
Thank you.
Did you have a question, Vice President Beckman?
Yeah, I had two. Going back to the question about the lag, my question isn't about a lag, it's about a delay from when a student would be positive, reported to the county before it's confirmed and back to us. So how long is that duration typically? So if my student stayed home today because they had COVID-like symptoms, so a day or two later, I decide to take my child to urgent care and they get a test, and then I don't report it to the school, say that it goes to the county, and then our school finally hears about it, how long is that?
So if that were the case, it could be 10 days, but we've had that once. So what happens more often than not, the only time that happened was with the athlete at the end of September. All of the rest of the time, we have had the cases reported to us by the student or family. Then we follow up with the family to get the lab-confirmed case. Once we have that in hand, there's a process to submit that information to the health department. They then start their process, but we can begin our identification of close contacts and quarantining immediately. That did not used to be the case. Back in October, we would give them the lab-confirmed positive case. Then they would ask us to wait to do any close contact and quarantining until they confirmed the case themselves. That took 5 to 10 days, and by the time we got the information back from them, you were already through most of the quarantine period, which defeated the purpose. So that process has changed.
That's the distinction I wanted to point out, that we're no longer waiting to throw it up on our dashboard, that we are talking to the parent then, getting that positive test, and then we're immediately putting it on our dashboard, correct?
Yes.
And then we're getting confirmed on the other end of it.
What's on our dashboard reflects that week of active cases. Our nurses are tracking on a daily basis. And Dr. Hagegot and Dr. Sackos let me know every time they get another positive case confirmed. They'll identify how many close contacts were identified. Letters go out to the close contacts as well as general letters to notify people of a potential COVID exposure. And we've gotten pretty consistent in how that information goes out.
Okay. One other question peripherally, going back, sorry to exhaust all of you guys on that sub-fill rate, but I do have a few questions. One last specific one. So I know that we recently started this social media campaign and whatnot to find substitutes for the classroom to help out because we are short subs, as we've talked about tonight. Are we doing anything beyond that? My concern is regardless of how we proceed forward, our teachers are working incredibly hard. So is all of the staff at the school. Let's not forget to thank everyone that's stepping in and pinch hitting and helping here. But in the essence of reporting and making sure everybody stays healthy, I get concerned that teachers may not feel well and not want to inconvenience their colleagues and therefore, and call out, and therefore they're tired, they're coming to school maybe when they shouldn't be coming. So my concern is that we are really being aggressive in trying to find help for our specific sites that are showing us in this data that we're having problems. Because the fill rate here that we're showing that we filled it is only going to go up, that we have this, window of, or difficult, the numbers are that we're not filling. So I'm just curious, what else are we doing beyond that social media campaign? And is it working, et cetera? Can we speak to that at all, Dr. Bowman?
So Dr. Bowman would have to speak to whether or not it's working. I will say that one of the strategies that we've been pursuing is there's a provision in state statute that allows for emergency sub-certification for our classified staff. And so we've been processing a significant number of those so that we can have additional supply of emergency subs available on our different campuses. I don't know what the total number is now, but we've signed quite a few. But Dr. Bowman, can you answer the question?
Yeah, I can. We've been doing quite a bit to try to bolster our substitute pool. One of them is what Dr. Menzel mentioned is the emergency sub. We've actively and aggressively pursued that within our own staff, and we're also reaching outside to our community in general for the emergency cert. Primarily what we're looking for there is subs who we would like to go into the remote push-in model ones if they're in emergency status. That would be a good match for them because the criteria for an emergency sub is a high school diploma versus a regular sub, which is a college diploma. So we're doing that. We've worked in a coordinated fashion with our communications department, who have done just a really hard push for us on advertising, and not just Facebook, but in all the different social media platforms. Also to include publishing those things on Indeed and our primary career pathway third-party vendors who help us promote positions. We also continually refresh our posting so that it rises to the top, because the way our system is designed is it's a time-based system, so the jobs that are posted most recent are at the top of the list. So we continually refresh our subs so that when somebody goes to our website and they click on the careers tab, they're going to see that. In addition to that, we've we increased the compensation, like we said earlier, for covering within a building for sub periods. We've also looked outside at third-party vendors. This isn't what we've done. We didn't have action on this, but a lot of companies purport that they'll come in and help you with your sub problems, but what they really want is they want your whole sub contract. They don't want to just help you with part of the problem. They want to come in and take over all of your subs. We haven't found a company yet. I think there is a couple out there. We're continually looking at it that will help us with our high use days, and so we're continuing that aspect. We interviewed 2 of them and to no avail so far. I'm probably forgetting something, but we did a hiring fair. We did a virtual hiring fair back in October to attract people to our school district, not just for subs, but subs were included in that. And so we're continually seeking input. We're continually trying to find ways to bolster that pool so that our sub fill rates will increase and get back close to 80s and 90% versus 70s.
Okay, and I appreciate that. One last comment. Have we reached out to our retired educators? I mean, officially reached out? Is there any, I know there's a lot of educators out there that retired over the last couple of years that we may want to say, do you want to feel comfortable enough to help us out? Have we?
It hasn't been purposeful. Sorry about that. It hasn't been purposeful to that group. Specifically, what we continually find, and I don't mean to stereotype, but with COVID right now, part of our challenge with subs going into buildings is people that are in a higher risk category, and sometimes some of our retired folks fall into that. And I'm not trying to be disparaging in any way. Just I think that it's a really good idea. I think we can try to get a list of the people who have retired in the last couple of years and aggressively market them as well.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Bowman. Vice President Beckman, are you done with comments? All right, anybody else? Board Member Greenberg.
Assuming nobody has any questions or comments right now. Right. So I think looking all this over, my position, not to beat a dead horse, but my position throughout has been we really need to follow the state, county, and federal health officials and what they're telling us to do. And to borrow from a newcoming board member, Dr. Hart-Wells, she made a very good comment, which was our district has all of the responsibility and none of the authority, meaning we're responsible for our students, we're responsible for our staff. We can decide to close schools, we can decide to leave them open, but when it comes to authority, we are not experts in this area, and we do not really have the power of persuasion. I mean, there's nothing we can really say to people to comfort them beyond, we understand how difficult this is. We understand the position that we're putting you in, and both educationally, both as a staff member. We know how hard you're all working, whether you're a student or a member of staff. It puts us in a very tight bind. And we've received just a massive volume, and there's obviously a very clear divide, largely between how our staff feel, which is of significant concern to me, and how our community feels with students in campus. And I think those concerns in part have a lot of valid backing. When we look at our case counts and we say, Arcadia High School, for example, 0.23% active cases, while over 100,000 is 0.1%. So the rate, if you wanted to convert it, is for Arcadia High School specifically this week, 230 cases per 100,000 people. So there is concern when I broke this down looking at the different grade levels that there are cases that we know about, assuming that and that's a conservative estimate that these are all the cases, because we know from the county that probably for every one case we do know about, there are 3 to 4 additional cases we do not know about. But notwithstanding that, the high school converted rate to this 100,000, just so we're all talking about the same numbers, is about 273 cases per 100,000. That is the rate of student and staff at our schools. So I understand that concern that our high schools are technically higher than our average as a community of 180 cases per 100,000. I also accept the fact that there are ways of better balancing our resources if we were to close high schools and move subs to the middle schools and provide that relief. There is obviously a concern that, because it is the traveling period, if staff members are meeting with their family for Thanksgiving, not just the students, but if we have staff who need to travel or have plans or get sick for any other reason, it sounds like, we have enough schools that the overall burden could be pretty big and could really stretch out more schools quite thinly than if we closed a group like the high schools where we do see the most amount of cases and moved into the middle schools. And I do also accept that the closure is only for a 2.5 week period, except for the exams that they need to come in and take, or their final projects, whatever it is they have, or if they take them virtually. I don't know how the finals are specifically done in each class at each high school. But the balance with that is, I did promise, and I have promised to myself to always follow the state and county. And so what I have personally come up against in speaking with the staff is that they are understandably very concerned, because if they're hearing from their students or their parents that they work with, oh, hey, we're traveling for Thanksgiving, we'll be back on next Monday and everything. And, personally, I think we all see it going out in our community on weekends. I ride my bike through the green belt. I go past all of the football and baseball fields and soccer, and there are tons of kids and tons of parents out there, none of them wearing masks, very much clumped together, which is a shame. It's that weird, it's just a really bad situation to be in. And I don't know, and I'm opening it up for my colleagues, what the proper position is. Because we know from the CDC, as Dr. Menzel said, at all costs, you should try to keep your schools open. But the CDC guidance itself says, it's true, that's what we want you to do, but that also depends on what is going on in your community. I mean, if things are out of control, we can't do that. And we need the community, in addition to the schools, to follow the mitigation efforts, or eventually this would be taken out of our hands. So I guess my question to the board and to Dr. Menzel would be, what is the response to acting preemptively? I mean, is the response solely that working with the experts think that a preemptive action at this time would not be a good idea for the many reasons we know? Is that it, or is there another? Are there other reasons to say, a preemptive action at this time, at least at some grade levels, is not advisable because we are talking about such a short period of time both ways? 2-week period of time, is that going to really change anything? I don't know. I'm curious to hear what you all think.
So I appreciate the question, and I think there are a couple of things to consider. One, schools closing in isolation from the larger community, making decisions to slow the spread, really doesn't change that trajectory. So then the question is, are we really protecting our students? And so you see a number of public health officials weigh in that kids are actually safer in school than not in school. That doesn't change the sense of risk, and particularly with our older students. And so I think it is part of the balancing act, but we really need the community, if they're serious about schools staying open, to support the other mitigation strategies that we know work. Wear a mask, wash your hands, stay physically distanced, make different choices in terms of the number of people you get relaxed with unmasked, because that's where these things spread. And so we want to be able to keep our schools open. If there is an issue or an opportunity when we think about high schools, because I went down this road thinking about, okay, for 2 weeks and then you've got an exam week essentially, could we mitigate some of the risk, address some of the concerns that we have, and what would be the impact on students? And the truth is, it depends on the student. There are some students who would be able to make that shift. They would be able to do it without it being particularly challenging. They may not like it because by nature our students are social beings and would like to be together, but they could probably understand. There are some students where that won't be the case. And so when you talk with Amy Palatucci at Coronado, there are a number of her students who won't re-engage in EDL. They weren't successful before. They'll go to work. They'll be AWOL. We won't find them. I don't know if any of you saw the 60-minute segment on the thousands of kids, and across the country even more than that have just gone missing, and the yeoman's effort of social workers and others to try to track down these kids. I mean, the pandemic has really been harsh and cruel to too many young people. So it's that balancing act to figure out, is that exchange one that we need to make now? Is it one that we should wait until we see, additional data? And we're looking at a period of time that I don't think there's a crystal clear answer. I think it's about the best decision we can make at the time. The reason why we have a potential action item on the agenda is that following the decisions the governing board has already made, without a recommendation from the health department to close any school, I would need different authorization in order to be able to move in that direction, because we don't have the data to do so.
don't know how everybody else feels.
So, as Board Member Greenberg has mentioned, and part of the reason we're here tonight is because we don't get to talk amongst ourselves to know how we're feeling. I also believe that our community who has elected us is out there asking to hear from leadership of their governing board. So, thank you for moving right into that direction. So is there any other governing board members who would like to provide their opinions or views on what SUSD should be doing moving forward? Board Member Proberg.
I guess I can jump in. What this evening has confirmed for me, at least, as the weeks have gone on that we're in person, and what I've been grateful for over these last few weeks is that every situation, especially school by school, begins a dialogue. And I'm grateful for that. I'm grateful that it's not just this number, check, this number, no. I'm glad that what I've seen over the last few weeks is our district is able to have thoughtful dialogue around the data and student-focused decision-making day by day. I personally do not feel at this time we should change that direction. I think we're showing, and I feel like tonight confirms that, and hopefully for our community confirms, that we're not ignoring this. Our principals are not ignoring this. Our staff, they're living it. Our staff is living it. And I do have confidence that our sites can either raise the red flag when they need to and keep going when they can. If U.S. superintendents say, no, we're tight at, the tipping point for everyone, I don't hear that tonight, so please make it clearer if that is the case. But what I do hear is some of our schools they're making it. And I wouldn't want to take action tonight that derailed any of that if it is possible to continue. So I'll leave it at that simple now, and I'm hoping we just stay the course personally.
Any other board members?
Still gathering
You're
my
not-
thoughts.
Board Member Kravitz.
Well, no, I just was repeating what I said earlier. I think it's important to look at the data at each site and see what's going on at each site. As you said, work with our principals. It's a balancing act of what's going on at the site and also with the staffing at the site. I mean, I don't want to see teachers giving up, their prep period all the time either, but I think, if like I said, it's a balancing act, and we need to look at each site individually, and to just wholesale close schools, I don't know that is the answer. And I guess I'm looking for guidance as to what your recommendation is.
Thank you. Want to say anything?
Well, no, and I think we've all admitted that we're not medical experts, and so we come here always hoping that we can get some guidance to going forward, because all of you, Dr. Menzel, you included, really are the boots on the ground. You're telling us what's going on in our schools. Our teachers are telling us what's going on in our schools. And, certainly what we see is concerning, but the discussions we've had around the data are important discussions. And I'm looking forward to having these discussions. I mean, most community members that I've talked to, I've let them know that we're having these every single day. It is not happening just board meeting to board meeting, that we don't talk and then we review things 2 weeks later. They're every single day, a lot of them multiple times a day, and that won't stop. I mean, this is an emergency board meeting or a special meeting or whatever that we called because of these factors. We could have another one in 2 days, hopefully not, but we could. We are looking at this very, very closely. The pause I have, well, that's twofold. I want to take care of our teachers. I want to make sure that we get them the help as much as possible, because we are trying to educate our kids, and they are going the extra mile. And I want to keep succeeding if we're succeeding, most definitely. The conversation around whether to go virtual or not is a difficult one. We are making progress with a lot of these kids. We're getting multiple emails that say, my child is smiling again. My child is learning again. My child is the happiest I've seen them in months. Please don't take that away. But I'm also getting emails from teachers that say, I can't keep this up. And they're the ones that are creating that, right? So we need to help our educators. I've thought about this 24 hours a day. And one of the concerns I had around the data is that we aren't necessarily seeing the numbers reflected in the data, and I'm trusting the data that you give us in our schools right now. And so we're looking at that data, we're looking at the community data. My concern is if we go virtual now, that pretty soon all we'll have left is the community data. And in January, or when second semester starts, that will be our only data point. And we would look at that, and most likely it's not going to be better. So where would we find our way back? That's my concern. And then we'd be looking at second semester, being transparent to our community, then we'd be looking at even a longer duration, and pretty soon it's a year, right? That these kids have not really been in school. And so we have to find a way forward, and it's not an easy, there's not an easy answer to this. But if we are going to keep looking at the data, which I would like to do daily, call a meeting when necessary, and find the best way to support our educators, and it can't just be a talking point. I really want to get creative around these topics so that we can provide them with support, if at all possible. Find money where we have to help get extra bodies in there helping them out, do as much as we can. So,
Thank you. Board Member Kravitz.
Oh, forget, I'll.
No, go ahead.
Well, when you refresh my memory, some of our, if I recall correctly, we were generous in staffing with Seoul, is that correct? Scottsdale Online?
Well,
And are most of the teachers that are teaching on Scottsdale Online, they requested that because they didn't want to be in a classroom, or they just?
so we've got a combination. Some of our sole teachers are there because they requested it and met the
Right.
two priority categories. Some actually were surplus there. Some of our other staff that requested accommodations are teaching EDL.
Okay, so some of them that you mentioned that were surplus, could some of those teachers help alleviate the sub-rate issue?
Well, they've all got full caseloads, and they've got a higher caseload in Scottsdale Online than they would if they were in a classroom.
Okay, that answers that question then. Because when I hear that we were generous in staffing, I wasn't sure exactly what that looked like or what that meant. And then, how many, okay, no, I'll wait. Thank you.
I had also, I'll weigh in. First of all, I just really want to thank the staff, the parents, and the community members who have emailed or voiced their opinions through the various medias. And I want you to know that personally, I have read them, even if I haven't responded to you in the past 3 or 4 days. I appreciate that everyone is doing their best to care for each other and that we remain faithful in our obligations, our family, friends, and our SUSD students. I recognize that everyone is not of the same opinion because we're getting that. We are hearing that voice. And it's not the same opinion when we're making our decisions regarding our children, our students, or our staff. And I can only speak for I know I speak for others, but I'm speaking just for myself now, that we value the differences that we hear in each one of you. And that, we're hearing these emails. We know they're from your heart. They're from your experiences. And we have no doubt that everyone's being honest and caring in their views. But decisions like these are not easy, as not everyone will feel that they are heard, even though no matter what we say, we do hear you. And I don't know what I can say to make you feel that you've been heard if the decision doesn't go the way you feel it should. And that's one of the reasons that this is so difficult, and that you look at the data, you look for a balance, you look for trying to understand does one way more than the other, in the sense of, is it 70% one way and 30% the other. And what's happening is it truly is looking at a 50-50, whether you look at parents or whether you look at the staff. And so please know that these decisions that we're making don't come lightly. I know that they're weighing on everyone. They're weighing on the staff. They're weighing on the leadership. They're weighing on the governing board. And we are listening to reviews. We're reading the news. We're listening to opposing sides just to be able to justify how we could vote one way or the other and vote the best way and still respect the other voice. And that is so difficult. We just, I just ask that you try to, if it doesn't go your way, that you try to open your heart to maybe look at it from a different perspective. I did not make up my mind whether we'd be voting tonight because I wanted to hear the presentation, even though most of this data, as it has been mentioned, we're very familiar with the data because we are asking the questions and we're getting the feedback in a very responsive manner. I also wanted to hear from our governing board members because we don't get to talk about this. And this is really the avenue in which that we can do that. And our community and staff have been asking because they can't hear from us really until we're in this meeting. So I want to thank every governing board member for opening up and giving your view at this time. I too, and it won't be a surprise, look to data. And I am finding also that the data is showing, obviously the increasing spread from the community, but it is not being reflective in our buildings. And so I join everybody else in thinking we do need to look at what is happening with our buildings. We don't have it up there right now, but we're just not seeing that spread. But that doesn't mean we won't. But I agree that we need to remain open after Thanksgiving, not as an experiment, but because I have faith in this community that we will be implementing the safety mitigation strategies of wearing our masks, physical distancing as we can. We're offering some new opportunities. If you do, you find yourself being just more comfortable, if you had that plexiglass, well, we can get it in there. And providing maybe a little bit more protection with masks. I think that we owe it to our students to remain open, but knowing that come Thursday and Friday after that week, and I've asked Dr. Minzlis specifically, how fast can we stop if we need to? If we see a building that all of a sudden has, and as you mentioned, it's 278 times 100,000. Well, we don't have 100,000 in our schools. Right. So we have 2,000, let's say, at our highest, the highest 2,200. But, that's 40 cases, right, if you take that same percentage. So if we all of a sudden have an outbreak, a very large outbreak, we could turn and say on that Thursday or Friday, we can go virtual at that building. We will be able to do it, is what I have been assured. And we can assure you that the governing board will be available. I personally asked everybody. Everybody's going to be in town and or at least available. And we're not just going to be available through Thanksgiving. And actually, I've talked to the other governing board members that are leaving. We're going to be here. Typically, you kind of say goodbye after the last meeting, the last board meeting. Well, with the pandemic, we're not going to do that. We're going to be here all the way to December 31 or until the incoming board members have been installed as governing board members, and we'll be available so that we can be responsive to you. So I agree with my fellow board members on the fact that I think that we should stay our course for now, knowing that we could see a rise, and we're going to be very cognizant of it. We're asking, I know, our principals and our teachers to let us know what's happening in the building, and that there is that gray area, and that's that tipping point. Mm-hmm. And that's why it's going to be so important for our administrators to have that open dialogue. And it's appreciated, because we know it's not always that easy. So I just really want to thank you. That's all I have to say Board Member Perlberg.
I just have one question regarding those comments, and I'm sure our community would appreciate the clarity. Just like you stated, if one campus comes back week in and is having an issue, is a board vote required to take action for that campus?
Not
I
for
don't
one,
believe so,
not for one
correct?
campus. If we have a case, and quite frankly, the Maricopa County Department of Public Health would be looking at those specifics. So if you have that increased number and/or we can't staff, so those two variables, we would be, under current board authorization, able to make the determination to have that building return to virtual.
That's, I'm
Thank
happy
you-
to leave
thank
here
you for the
tonight with that
clarification.
that being assured, so, because we would not want to hold up any sort of action that is necessary.
My point was
Yeah.
just that
Yeah,
if something came up that we did need to vote on,
It
and I'm
is
so glad that you clarified that, so
that
thank
it's
you.
true. I'm not traveling anywhere, so,
Yeah.
yeah, it's all good. Thank you.
Board Member Greenberg.
So first, thank you, all of you, for sharing your views, because I am in agreement. The difficulty has always been that we use the data, and the response has always been, we can't trust the data. That the data is wrong, that we know that there are more cases than there are not. The problem is we just don't know. I mean, I know what I personally feel of the number of cases, and I am sure that they are definitely higher than what we actually know. But the question is, are we having cases where people are likely getting it on campus? The CDC itself has said throughout this entire process that the number of students and staff who have COVID is going to very likely mimic the number of cases you have in the community as a whole. The issue is not whether you have people with COVID, it's whether they are on campus and you are transmitting it on campus, and therefore you are more likely or as likely to contract COVID as any other location. We say, and it's the only thing I can work with, we say that the number of cases of transmissions on campus, likely transmissions on campus, are relatively low, even if we multiply it by a factor of 4 or 5. We don't know for sure because we don't have the daily testing. We don't have the rapid data structure where immediately if someone gets tested, we automatically know and everything's good. There are significant limitations that we have, and I believe that really ultimately is what drives the concern of our staff and students and families, that there is just this general distrust or desire not to follow the data, and for all these limitation reasons. And those limitations, I think, are very logical. I think the arguments people are presenting of, we have more cases than we know about, are perfectly logical. But the problem is that the weight, in my mind, of the weight of all the research at this time and everything that we know is that it is safer to be in school, whether you're working there or you're a student, than it is to be just out in the community generally, and that the risk of transmission is relatively low. If we look to other countries, because people have pointed this out, people have said, well, look at other countries. I've even pointed that out. Yeah, it's true, right? France has kept their schools open. The UK has kept. They've also gone into lockdown, though. And I think that goes to Dr. Menzel's point. We really need our community to. I know it sucks. It was my grandmother's 90th birthday the other day. I've had losses in the family. We can't do the funerals. We can't do the birthdays. We can't do the celebrations, as Jewish High Holy Days, earlier already. We've already come through a lot of them. We can't celebrate those together. That really sucks. But we really need people to wear the masks and to follow the protocols, because there's a balance there, and we will see more cases, I think. I still think as well, the issue of acting, we're also going to get that pushback, and it's logical, right? if we do have an outbreak, the argument will be, well, you could have seen this coming and you should have acted preemptively. I think we all know that that's going to be the argument. But the problem is if the county health department is looking at all this, I assume they understand there are more cases than we have listed here and in our community generally, because it was their own data which confirmed that. I assume that they're taking all of this into account and advising us based on their expert opinion what we should do. I am happy to hear that we are re-reviewing the potential January transition back based on all of this. Because I think that is a relief that has been sought by a lot. That lunch period has, and it's good, again, that it's reinforced by the county health department, is causing concern from an epidemiological standpoint, and that we might have to rework a number of these things. So I'm happy to hear that, looking at that period of time, we've already heard feedback and concerns about our model that we might need to revise some things. For this 2-week period, I personally, I just don't see the evidence there. I know that staff are really concerned. I know that we're all just waiting until somebody gets sick and is hospitalized or dies. Like, I understand that. But I think it's really very risky to start making up our own rules and how we're going to be doing things. I've always thought it was risky. I didn't approve of what happened in March. So I agree with all five of you, really. I think we need to look at this the way that the county is telling us to do, and we just have to do what they tell us.
Well, with that, I think what's important is we're not just doing what the county's telling us, because I think we're doing more. And I think that is, we are having dialogues to understand the data that we have and to ask the relevant questions and get relevant answers back. So if there is a nugget in there that's not showing in the
Right.
data, we will know about it. And we're going to act on that, not just the data. And I think that's the important point
Right.
that we've been doing all along. And that's why Dr. Sunshine's become one of your best friends, I'm sure. And so I'm hoping that gives comfort to our staff and to those community members who want to, have us go virtual. If you would like to go virtual, have your student, it's my understanding you can. You can self-quarantine after the Thanksgiving holiday. No one is forcing you to go back in person. Is that correct?
That's correct. So if, we've asked people who traveled to voluntarily quarantine, but if families, and I said this to the Scottsdale Parent Council in response to a question, if families don't feel comfortable coming back and we're in person, they can choose to keep their child at home. We will work to provide educational support for them for the balance of the 3 weeks that we are in session. And so if you want to wait a week to see what's happening, if you want to wait 2 weeks, we'll provide support just as if you were out being ill. You don't have to change models. That was the question. Do we shift from in-person to EDL? Not for the last 3 weeks of the semester. We'll find a way to provide support. It'll be different. It's not going to be like you've just moved into EDL, but we can provide that support. I as a parent of children myself, and having been a superintendent for 19 years, I always believe that parents have that ultimate responsibility to decide what's best for their child. On a snow day, some parents thought it was too dangerous to go to school, and we still had school. On some days when we didn't have school, they thought we were crazy and wanted us to have it. But if we had school and they thought it was too dangerous, I always said, make the choice to keep your child at home. That's your right and responsibility as a parent, and we'll support that. There'll be no negative penalty as associated with that choice, and the same is true here.
Board Member Greenberg.
I apologize. I really appreciate that clarification. I didn't mean to speak about that say that in a kind of trite way. I do appreciate that. We are doing a lot, and we do have the mitigation efforts in place, a number of them, which the CDC is very big on if you want to stay open, especially if your case counts are rising. With the voluntary quarantining after this, if people are traveling, because I know that's something that teachers have given to us, staff members have given to us, it is concerning, I personally.
Yeah.
Do we have any ability to make that a mandatory thing? I mean, is the county able to help us with that? Is there anything we can do there? Because, there's a lot of rumors going around about all sorts of things. Some of them seem to be more true than not. Is there any way to improve or strengthen that?
So I asked that question. We're not likely to get a position from the Maricopa County Department of Public Health to make it mandatory. But Dr. Sonnenschein indicated the district likely has authority to make such a policy. If we're using scientific evidence to support the quarantine. So for example, flying in a commercial plane, it creates a risk that people have identified, but driving wouldn't constitute the same risk. So if the board was interested, we have a meeting on December 1st. And in communicating with Michelle Marshall, we could draft something for the board to adopt where if we knew that a family had flown and they were still sending their student to school, that we could require a quarantine. It appears that that would be within the district's statutory authority to do so if you adopted a policy.
How would, excuse me,
How do we enforce that?
Yeah. Board Member Kravitz.
how would we, not even enforce, but
How would we know?
how would we know?
Well, there are a number of ways. One, sometimes kids talk.
Well, yeah, kids.
Sometimes people post things on Facebook or other things, and you know, it's one of those challenges. We've tried to approach it from we need the whole community to step up and just, you know, if the travel was worth it to you, then please stay home. And if you're at the secondary level, you can participate, you know, in the live streaming and stay up with classes. We're just mitigating the risk for our teachers and for our fellow students. And I think that's a sign of respect. That's what we're asking people to do.
Right.
And you don't have to feel like COVID is a big deal, but in this environment, it is a really big deal. There are people who have lost their lives. There are people who've gotten very seriously sick. What we want is to be able to show that kind of care and concern for our fellow students and colleagues in the classroom. And if we do that, then we can avoid the potential spread. And if we find out there's some people who are sending their children, if we had the policy, then we would be able to exclude them for that 2-week period of time, because the 14 days is essentially 10 school days. That would be an option that the board could consider.
Well, okay, can we,
Board Member Kravitz.
sorry, can we vote on that today? As part of our, I don't know how it's written on our agenda.
Yeah, we'd have to draft it and go through some additional review. So if the board was interested.
Well, preliminary then.
Well, I was going to say, the first I've heard of it, so I have not given it any thought, just to let you know. So that I am really backing that we ask our community to look, to start, let's all act like a community. We're in this together. This is a pandemic, it's serious. And we need to support our neighbors in our community. And if we travel, then, you know, you can get a test. You know, stay virtual until you're, you know, that 5-day
Right.
period and 7 days and then come back. But
Well,
you
yeah.
could be virtual. Board Member Kravitz.
One thing, I think we kind of buried the lead here, so you've said it, Dr. Menzel said it, but if you have gone out of town, or for some reason you do not feel comfortable sending your child back to school, you can go virtual. I don't think we can say that enough. There are some people that perhaps sent their children back to school thinking, you know, they wanted their child back on campus, and we're now hearing from them saying, you know, their child doesn't feel safe, then go virtual. There's nothing stopping you from that. It will help reduce our class sizes for sure. So again, let's not bury the lead. That is the headline. If you don't feel comfortable sending your child back into the classroom, go virtual after Thanksgiving, and we recommend it.
Board Member Perlberg.
And thank you for that. And so just for clarity, maybe because you talk to Sonnenschein every day practically, for testing, let's say you travel, 3 to 5 days wait and then test, is that what is currently being recommended? Or more?
5 to 7.
Or is it longer?
So it technically is still longer. So the incubation period is 2 to 14 days. So you can still get a negative test and then be positive, you know, day 12.
Okay.
So it can, it's not that it's immaterial. I mean, if you want some assurance and you test and you get a negative, that's nice. But it's really not a guarantee that you're not potentially positive, which is why the quarantine period is a fixed 14 days. Now, there's ongoing research, and some potential that that number might end up being lower in the future, but the evidence hasn't been vetted sufficiently to make that a new policy yet. And what the health department has assured us is that as new information and research becomes available, they'll adjust accordingly.
Okay, well, and thank you. And I certainly, obviously, support the request made to our community to be responsible, and let's keep these kids in person and coming to school. On the flip side, and I assume this is just an obvious question, but I want to make sure we ask it tonight, is our teachers, our staff members who do travel or have large gathering or something concern, we already have some teachers who teach virtually, especially at the high school level, correct? In the middle school as well? So.
Maybe in one case for middle school, I think there might be a couple of, but mostly at the high school.
How are we set to provide opportunities for the teachers who need to? I traveled, I still want to teach my class, but I can do it virtually safely. How ready are we to provide that access?
So as essential employees, if they're non-symptomatic, they can still report to work. They're not required to quarantine under those provisions, and so they can report. We, as you know, we struggle with subs. So I do worry that after the break, we're going to find that in a couple of our buildings, we might be in a position where we have to shut down a couple buildings and go back to virtual because of that. So we'll be prepared. I mean, that's one of the things that we do is prepare for those various scenarios. And so we would know that Monday the 30th, December 1st, somewhere in that ballpark. But
So specifically, will we have the ability for a teacher who just feels a lot more comfortable teaching virtually themselves to a live classroom is what I'm referring to?
Well, the problem is because we have to have an adult in the classroom and we're already having a
So
difficult time with
you
filling subs.
still have that problem.
We can't go to scale with that, which would then drive us to making that building virtual.
Okay, all right, appreciate that.
Board Member Greenberg.
So, okay, on the mandatory thing, I don't know how my colleagues feel because I can't really get a good sense, but I would like to have that discussion. And I don't know if December 1st seems to me a little too late, and maybe we can just have one of our pre-reopening meetings just through the computer on Zoom, a quick one to go over what we can do, before Thanksgiving break, because I do think we need to give families notice ahead of time. I will say, with the teacher comment and that concern, that is probably my main concern, really, is that we have staff that are extremely, extremely worried. And I understand that. I don't blame them at all. But they are extremely worried. And, I know we've received emails that have said, that we have staff members who've considered retiring now or what have you. All I can say to that is, I'm really sorry about that. Our staff have to do what they feel is best for them. I understand that. This is a very difficult time. So in no way am I personally upset about that. But if that does actually come to fruition, or we do have a high volume of staff who have plans and are going to, traveling or whatever for these holidays, again, I think that's unfortunate, and that concerns me greatly. But that we might not have staffing for some of our schools, like some other school districts have experienced, that gives our families almost no time to plan. And so I just want us to acknowledge that these next 2 weeks are hopefully going to run smoothly, because our community is hopefully going to follow the rules. They're not going to be traveling. They'll be following the mitigation strategies. That is the hope. Our staff as well. But there is always a potential risk that we might have to close out of the blue because we do have either an outbreak and we're required to close, or because of resource limitations, we have to close, which has happened at other school districts already. So I think it's important that we are very clear that this could be a 24-hour turnaround for some of these campuses. So just thought that. But I would like to discuss the mandatory requirement. I think there are ways, enforcement we can do through a number of things. It might not be 100% guaranteed, but there are ways and we can discuss it, I think of raising the stakes for not following it, that might deter quite a lot of people from even wanting to attempt. But I think that needs to be discussed before Thanksgiving if we're going to discuss it rather than after when everyone's returned. Okay, thank you.
All right. Well, I will consult with Dr. Menzel on that and get back to everybody. I have a couple things running in my head that I want to ask, but I really don't want to bring them up because I don't
Right.
want it to bubble up
Right.
and be something that it's not. So I think that we need to, at this point, say this is an opportunity to examine that, not that it is something that we are definitely going to be
Right.
moving towards.
Because there's a lot of questions around.
A lot of questions.
A lot.
From a lot of different viewpoints at staffing as well. So, all right. So I got the impression we are not moving on to any action item. I don't know, Michelle, if I need to ask if there is a motion and then just wait for not to have one, or?
Certainly ask, or you could table it.
Oh,
A motion to table.
all right. Why don't we go ahead and table action item A, and we will, now, when you say table,
That implies it's-
then I need, it implies it's coming back, and then if you table it and I pick that up, we need to vote on it because it's been tabled, correct?
So,
Okay, why don't we do that? Or can I just, or do I just
Ask
move
for a
to see
motion
if
and-
I have a motion?
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and call for a motion, thank you. Call for a motion on action item A. Our action item A was the governing body will review and discuss current COVID-19 related data and may take action if it's determined any change in the approach to the district's teaching and learning models is required. So, do we have a motion? All right, no motion? And so we will move on from that. So, okay. If there's no further actions tonight, I move to adjourn this special meeting of the governing board. Do I have a second?
second.
Vice President Beckman seconds. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion passes 5-0. The special meeting of the governing board on Monday, November 23rd, 2020 is adjourned at 6:58 PM.